Hey everyone, how's it going out there? So today we're going to finish talking about Chapter 13, Section 3, the Holocaust. And we're going to continue to focus on the fact that, Hitler obviously had this master plan his entire life to kill Jews and homosexuals and gypsies and anyone who really didn't conform to his model of what he believed was the Aryan race, the superior race, even though he truly wasn't even really a member of the Aryan race. He was not German. He was not this blonde-haired, blue-eyed person, and he obviously did have a Jewish grandparent, we believe, with some Jewish ancestry. Yet, despite these facts, we know that his anti-Semitism grew over the years, and he had hatred for Jews. These feelings had increased over the years. He'd faced that physical and mental abuse from his father. He'd heard that Jews were nothing, and over time, he began to blame Jews for lots of his problems, like why he didn't get into that art school, why his mother died, perhaps even why the Germans lost World War I, combined with that anger, that resentment over World War I, was enough for him to eventually create that master plan that he articulated so well in Mein Kampf. And now that he is, in complete power over Germany, he has begun this Holocaust, this intentional genocide of the Jews and millions of other people who he feels are unworthy of being part of this Third Reich, of this grand empire, so to speak. So we started off last time talking about how the Holocaust is really divided into 4 stages, and we looked at stage 1, which is stripping Jews of their rights and the passage of the Nuremberg Laws. Up until this point, Jews and non-Jews had lived throughout Germany and Italy and, in peace for the most part. Jews, just like other groups, perhaps received, some discrimination. Perhaps people had refused to buy at their shops. And people had a prejudice against them, believing in the stereotypes, and that perhaps they lived, a life where they faced a lot of bias and discrimination, but there was no legalized discrimination. Remember, the problem with the Nuremberg Laws is it makes discrimination legal. It robs Jews of their citizenship rights. We looked last time specifically at those Nuremberg Laws analysis, how now they're no longer allowed to marry Germans, trying to stop the inbreeding of Germans and Jews, trying to stop future generations of Jews from perhaps corrupting the German bloodline. And now Jews are not allowed to attend German schools or own their own businesses. At first, they're allowed to still own them. It's just that you should be boycotting them. You should only be shopping in German shops. And over time, they'll be not allowed to own their own businesses either. At first, Hitler keeps those German businesses going because he's going to force Jews, especially the wealthy ones, to pay higher taxes. And he's looking for increased revenue from the Jewish population. But you're going to start seeing all sorts of segregated areas of society, very similar to Jim Crow America, with a black area and a white area. And so we're going to have a black area in the streetcar versus a white streetcar area. Same thing here in Germany, with areas for Jews to sit compared to areas for, Germans to sit, or non-Jews, so to speak. Now, although we're still in stage 1 of stripping Jews of their rights, discrimination is really starting to boil over, and it boils over on Kristallnacht, which is known as the Night of Broken Glass. And the reason they call this is because Hitler basically allows, his SS, remember those are his black-shirted security guards, to wreak havoc across the city, and he allows them to go in and to destroy Jewish synagogues, which are Jewish churches, to destroy Jewish businesses. And the idea is to put fear into the heart of every Jew, to let them know that, Hitler and the Germans are in charge and that they are nothing, that he can squash them in a bug at any moment. After this incident, many Jews are scared because we're going to see that 90 Jews die, hundreds were badly injured, thousands are obviously terrified, many lose money or property. And it seems clear that you can get away with persecuting and attacking Jews and you're not going to face any consequences, especially since this was a government-sanctioned attack. Even though they're going to try to say that it was gangs and things like that and that Hitler wasn't behind it. The Jews know the true story. They saw who attacked them. But obviously Hitler is going to control what is printed in the newspaper. He is a master of propaganda here, continuing to burn books and destroy, any evidence of Jewish heritage and culture and cultural superiority and achievements, really just focusing on the greatness of the German people. At this point, many Jews decide to leave. Unfortunately, they don't go far enough. They go to Austria, they go to Czechoslovakia, they go to surrounding countries, which will soon be part of the German Empire. So even though they get a few more years of freedom, it's not long enough, and some of them still end up in concentration camps and executed with Hitler's final solution of death. But some do escape, some do make it all the way to America, but many continue to stay. And you might say, why? Why would you stay? Well, it takes money to travel. They're afraid to leave their families and their homes. They don't know where to go. Perhaps they don't speak another language or have the wealth to travel. Perhaps they're too old or sick. Maybe they think things are simply going to get better, and this was just one isolated incident. People tell themselves all sorts of things. And now that Germany is already becoming a police state, it's becoming more and more difficult to escape Germany without papers. In the beginning here, Hitler is very willing to let you just go. But as things increase, it will be very difficult to get papers to truly escape Germany. Now, things are going to quickly isolate as we move into stage 2. And I've got some video clips, which we're going to show in class today from Schindler's List, which really kind of talk about that. And I'll post a couple of those. I realize I didn't post those. I'll add them to the Google Classroom feed. But we watch a couple of quick video clips in class today about Jews who are now being forced to their homes to live in the ghettos and what conditions are like in the ghettos. And many Germans were happy to see the Jews leave. They felt like the Jews were dirty and inferior and corrupting and bad influences on their children and their families, and they didn't want them to be dating or intermarrying or living next to them. And so the propaganda campaign by Hitler had been working, plus many people had been anti-Semitic to begin with. And they figure, okay, let the Jews go and live in their own population where they can practice their culture and society as they see fit without kind of, hurting the rest of society. And of course, most Germans do not see pictures or footage or images of what it's actually like in these ghettos, how they're incredibly overcrowded, how they lack food, they lack, hospital status, access to medical supplies. The hospitals are poorly run, they're overcrowded. Some of the doctors are, going to treat the Jews the best that they can because they've taken the Hippocratic oath to treat all people, but other people are very unsympathetic, and they're willing just to let Jews die if they're sick or ill because they're like, well, they're an inferior group anyway. That's just natural selection. That's social Darwinism, just kind of weeding them out. And so these Jews will be forced to live in these terrible conditions. First, this will be happening in Germany and Italy, and then it's going to very quickly expand as, Hitler creates his Third Reich and takes over other countries. This will be happening in Poland and the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Hungary, you name it. Warsaw and Poland ends up being the largest ghetto, holding about 500,000 people, and it's about 3.5 square miles in size. So you're talking about having so many people live in one apartment where it's completely unhygienic. And of course, disease spreads rapidly. There's no privacy. It's terrible. And the situation in these ghettos is going to last for a couple years, where Hitler establishes them as he's kind of ramping up his hatred for the Jews. But he still doesn't, know what to do with the Jews. He's kind of isolated from the society. But if he had actually come out and said, I'm going to kill all the Jews at this point, he wasn't entirely sure how the world would react if they found out. He still hasn't made his empire yet. He hasn't proven that he's a true world leader because he hasn't conquered all of his territory yet. The war is just beginning. He's still kind of afraid of the United States. Will they come out and attack since they had, beat the Germans in World War I and were the only ones to really do so. So he's still unsure, and he's unsure of really how the German churches, there are religious people in Germany who are still members of the Catholic and the Protestant churches. How would they respond? So for the next couple of years, they're going to stay in segregation in these ghettos. And some Jews will continue to flee Germany. Prominent Jews, like on the left, you can see Albert Einstein. He flees Germany. On the right, that's Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank. He leaves. The problem with Otto Frank, all they do is move to Amsterdam, thinking that they're going to be safe there, and they're not, because of course, eventually that's going to be part of Hitler's empire as well. Albert Einstein obviously is able to come and move to the United States. The United States was willing to take people like Einstein, who were wealthy and educated and had, all of these different traits that they could bring to the U.S. But in general, America and other countries were not willing to take on all these other immigrants. And stories were starting to pour out about, Hitler is a terrible ruler and he's mistreating the Jewish population and homosexuals and gypsies and people who are disabled. And yet the U.S. government was like, well, we'll look into it. We'll maybe grant you a temporary work visa or school visa, but for now we're not sure. we were very hesitant to add more people to the US because, of course, we're still coming out of depression. We're putting America first, which makes sense logically because there's only so many jobs to go around. But at the same time, if you're not letting political refugees in, people who are facing death in their own country, you are in a sense assigning them to death, which is pretty much what we're doing. After the Nazis begin their onslaught, so Hitler actually starts to conquer other territories. He starts with Austria, his original home country. 3,000 Austrian Jews applied for American visas that day. And as you can imagine, most of them are going to be turned down. They're never going to receive visas. They're never going to be allowed to travel to the US. They'll end up stuck in Nazi-dominated Europe, which means they're pretty much going to die. And this political cartoon really lays it out well. There's a big funnel. All these Jews from Europe, whether it's Poland or Czechoslovakia or Austria or Germany, who are desperate to come to America. And we had this policy in terms of immigration that we were only letting about 3%. You can see it in the chart there. We were only letting about 3% of immigrants from each country come to the United States at that point. So we were trickling in just a few Jews at a time. And as you can imagine, we're going to be taking people who are incredibly smart, talented, have some type of skill. If you're a normal person, right, and you're middle class and you don't have the best job and you don't have a business, you don't have all these fancy degrees, we're pretty much going to say no. The other issue was money. The Nazis start to crack down. As soon as Hitler really starts to take over other territories and is truly gearing up for war, Hitler starts to crack down on how many Jews can leave Germany. He doesn't want word to get out how he's mistreating these people, because then perhaps people will look into him more and his facade will kind of crack, and perhaps the German people will even turn against him. So he doesn't want stories to get out about the harsh treatment of Jews in these ghettos. So he has the Nazis forbid Jews from taking more than $4 with them out of Germany. Well, that's a real problem because the American government, as well as many other countries, said, we're not going to let people move to the U.S. unless they have money with them, because otherwise they're going to basically be stuck, where we're paying for them. And the U.S. did have a sense of a welfare system in place during the Great Depression. It obviously still does to this day, as the New Deal policies were put into place. But we were very concerned about paying for these people for the rest of their lives. They become a public charge, and we don't want that. So we basically say, no, we're not going to give them refugee status and let them move to the U.S., and we're just going to cap how many immigrants can pretty much move here. And so it's not just the U.S. doing it, it's all these other European countries, France, Britain, the ones that are still democracies, and the dictatorships really were not interested in letting, Hitler's cast-offs, so to speak, move to their nation, especially because they wanted to be on Hitler's good side. And so it was only about 150 immigrants were going to be allowed to come in annually. Immigrants attempt to move to Africa, to South America, but they're also coming up with similar issues. One of the most famous cases is the SS St. Louis. And what happens here is it's May 27th, 1939. So it's right before World War I or World War II begins on September 1st of 1939 when Hitler attacks Poland. And so it's just a few months earlier. And many Jews are attempting to leave Germany, and they're supposed to be boarding a ship called the SS St. Louis. It's leaving Germany, and it's headed to Havana, Cuba. Now, these people think that, they've gotten permission from the Germans to go. They only have $4 with them. They don't really have any possessions, so to speak, except for, a change of clothes and some underwear, and no real money to speak of. And about 930 Jewish refugees believe that they have bought papers. They've either gotten legal documentation from the Cuban government that they can move there, or they've purchased papers from someone, and unfortunately those papers turned out to be fake, and they think that they can move there. Well, they get to Cuba, and once the boat arrives, the Cuban director of government and their leader basically says, no, you can't come aboard. I think that all of these certificates that you've been issued are fake. We never allowed all these people to move here. It's unclear about whether he was in on the scam to sell these illegal certificates, to, let these people move here, whether there had been some miscommunication about how many people were actually boarding the ship, whether the documents were falsified, whether Jews knew that they were buying fake papers just in a desperate move to get out of Germany. It's unclear what really went on here. But they refused to let that boat dock. And so now the ship captain is like, okay, I've got 930 people on board. We need to refuel. Are we just going to go back with them to Germany? Because he knew that if he brought them back, he was pretty much signing their death warrants, that they were going to go back to these ghettos. It was difficult for them to get out to begin with. And, violence was really ramping up here. And so he was very worried. He had contacted the Americans, hoping that since Florida was only 80 miles off the coast of Cuba, that they'd be allowed to dock there. But after several days of going back and forth, the U.S. government, you can see in those political cartoons, basically says no. And they deny the ship from docking. And unfortunately, the captain just couldn't, manage to bring them back to Germany. He knew that if he did, he was going to just be sending their death warrants. So he basically drops them off, some of them in France and Holland and Belgium, in Great Britain. Some of them had legal permission to enter. Some of them just tried to sneak in, so to speak, and it was difficult. But he was looking for countries, this captain, where there were still democracies in place, and there were leaders who were, going to let refugees enter, realizing that if they were sent back to Germany, they would die. Unfortunately, France, Holland, and Belgium will get conquered by Hitler. And so these people, many of them end up still dying because they go to a country which later gets controlled by Hitler. They are still known as Jews, and they get still sent to these extermination camps. And about 250 out of the 930 still end up dying as part of Hitler's final solution, where they are murdered in these extermination camps. Now, the violence does start to increase at this point. By January 20th, 1942, so the war began in 1939, the U.S. enters December 7th of 41. At the beginning of 42, so the United States really has not truly entered the war against Germany. We haven't, sent any troops over. It's going to take a long time, just like in World War I, to get troops ready and prepared and the U.S. mobilized and, truly get ourselves going. But on January 20th of 1922, several Nazi leaders meet at the Wannsee Conference, and they talk about what's next for the Jews. The Jews are not paying a ton of taxes anymore because they don't really have any money since they don't own their own businesses. It's costing us money to basically feed these people and house them and give them medical supplies. They had started killing Jews in many different ways by shooting them. But obviously you're using so many bullets by killing, one person at a time. So they started lining them up and then just shooting them and hoping the bullet would go through as many people as possible. They start putting the people, as many as they can fit, into a car and then leaving it running in a garage and kill them in that manner. I mean, it's absolutely horrifying. They start more experimentations on Jews in the ghettos, but now that it seems like the German population is truly in support of the war, but also terrified of Hitler's police state, they were not going to speak out against it because they were worried for their own families. And the United States was already drawn in the war, and rumors were already starting to leak out of the harsh treatment in the ghettos. Hitler basically decided to heck with it. So at this point, he decides, we're going to move the Jews to our next phase. We're going to move them to either concentration camps, where we're going to have them work until they die, or we're simply going to send them to extermination camps. And at these camps, some of them still might work until they die, or some of them, if they're too young or too old, will simply be killed right away. And they're going to be building a variety of these camps throughout Europe. And so it's really going to be the next phase is more so going to concentration camps, but soon after these extermination camps will be built. And concentration camps, in the terms of like political camps, had already existed throughout the entire war. So if, for example, you were found out to be a British spy, even before the war began, they'd be putting you in this concentration work camp where they'd be working you basically to death, but also terrorizing you and interrogating you for information, kind of serving a dual purpose. And at this point, I'll show another video clip about the destruction of the ghettos, because now that Hitler has a plan for the future, that he's going to work the Jews to death or simply exterminate them, and it's been decided upon as the final solution of what should happen to this Jewish problem of dealing with these inferior people, and he's no longer worried about the consequences. I show usually this video clip from Schindler's List about the destruction of the ghetto, and I'll post that one as well so you can see it. And so in the next stage, we've got these concentration camps, these work camps, and so people are going to be put on railroad cars, and they are not really going to be allowed to take anything with them. Once they get to the camps, they're going to be put into uniforms, and it doesn't matter if they're a Jew, a communist, a homosexual, a gypsy, someone who's too religious. They are an enemy to Hitler and to the state. They're not a fascist. They're not going to, submit to the Nazi party, they don't fit in with this Aryan race, they are going to be annihilated through work, and they are going to work to death, whether it's producing bombs or steel or farming or whatever it might be. Of course, they're going to work long hours. They may die from starvation, from exhaustion, from disease that spread quickly. And for the most part, the camps were built on railroad lines for efficient transportation, and they had factories near them. This slide, there's nothing you really need to copy down. That's why there's nothing in bold. But we can see that these are where really the work camps or the concentration camps are throughout Europe. And you've got famous ones like Dachau and this Buchenwald. And then you've got more so like death camps. And those were really meant just to straight up kill Jews. Those are really created, if you notice, more so in Poland in the eastern side, compared to the death camps are more so, or the work camps are more so in Germany. So they wanted those work camps close to them so they could be producing all of their supplies for the war. And then, as they conquered Poland, some of those Polish Jews would end up working in those concentration camps. But over time, to deal with the Jewish problem, they would be simply sent to these death camps where they would die. Life in the camps, as you can imagine, is absolutely awful. You can see all the people who are sleeping up there, and they're given like one little sheet and maybe some kind of straw, maybe a pillow. Rats were everywhere. They wear the same, clothes day in and day out. You can see they're barely fed. They were tattooed, basically, with this number, so people knew who they were. Their heads were shaved to prevent lice. Men and women were obviously separated, so you would never see your children or your family again, and your skills would be based off of your physical strength. And they also did all sorts of inhumane medical experiments on twins, on people who had special abilities, on people who had medical problems, to see how much pain they could experience, or could they cure people? What could they learn about human anatomy? Cruel and unusual and inhumane treatment. And so last but not least, we get to stage 4 of the Holocaust, which is straight up extermination. And in terms of extermination, you would have this Eisengruppen, which is a mobile killing unit where they would go around, and they'd been really around throughout the 30s. They were the groups I was mentioning that would find terrible ways to kill people, where they would simply shoot people over the side of a cliff, so then they would fall in the hole, so it could be a mass grave. And just find different ways to slaughter people. And now at these death camps that are based in mostly eastern Poland, the whole entire purpose is extermination. If they were young and healthy men and women, usually in their 20s, 30s, 40s, they would still most likely work until they died, doing war work. However, if they were young or if they were old, they would be euthanized. And so they would tell them that you're going to take this shower, take off all your clothes, take off all your jewelry, you're going to get it back later, hang it up after a shower, and then of course the shower is a gas chamber, and then they're going to slaughter all the people. And unfortunately, there are terrible stories of making soap out of people, of melting down the rings, of selling them in the clothes, of cutting off people's hair before they go in there to make wigs out of. I mean, it's just hideous as far as, what they're doing here. Like, it's just unconscionable. Zyklon B gas was the gas that was used, and Heinrich Himmler was the one who actually oversaw the final solution program. And obviously all these people who worked there knew what was happening. They would also go to hospitals, and if it seemed like they were Jews, whether they were young or old, children or not, if they had physical deformities, even German children who had physical deformities, they would be whisked away and they would be killed at some of these death camps. And people obviously who worked there all knew about the program. Did they think it was morally right? We assume not, but they went along with it out of fear that Hitler would do the same thing to their own families. And of course, some of the most infamous camps were at Treblinka and Auschwitz, where the vast majority of the population was exterminated. Nothing you really need to write down on this slide, but Auschwitz, we know, housed about 100,000 people in 300 prison barracks. They'd kill about 2,000 people at a time and about 12,000 people a day. And we think that about 1,600,000 people died at Auschwitz. About 1,300,000 of those were Jews. The rest of those were Polish people who were prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war, gypsies, homosexuals, kind of the other group. Unfortunately, they're also grouped together. Sometimes we don't have clear statistics about how many people actually died. because, sometimes they covered this information up or burned it. But in general, we have good records because the Nazis were very meticulous about documenting this and then sending regular reports to the Fuhrer, to Hitler. And you can see kind of how they're all built like factories and along railroad lines so they can bring people in and out. And the more they looked like a town and a factory, they scared people less, and they wanted people to work, obviously, till they died. They didn't want them to try to rise up. Not that it would have probably been very successful, though, since they lacked weapons. And of course, when you make it look more like a factory or a town, it also was difficult for the Allies, for the Americans, for the rest of the world to really see what was happening, because it just looks like this is a work camp, this is a factory, this is a town where they're forcing people to do odd jobs for the war effort. They had no idea that people were just openly getting slaughtered here. At least that's what most countries claim, that they had very little knowledge of what was actually happening. Now, did leaders higher ups in the military and sort in the government perhaps know? Perhaps. Did some people in Germany know? Most likely, yes. But the vast majority of the population was very clueless about how much the hatred of the Jews had gone to this extent. We're hoping that otherwise people would have spoken up, but at the same time, people in Germany were absolutely terrified. Even church leaders were absolutely terrified to speak out at this point. Eventually, we know, as the war comes closer to an end and Hitler is seeing that the Allied powers are closing in, and so are the Soviets, the Allies, included by the Americans, are coming from the West, and the Soviets are coming from the East, he begins to order that the Jews and the Poles and all the prisoners of war leave these camps, and they start to march long distances to areas where he has more control. We know that approximately 250,000 to 375,000 prisoners perished in these death marches. I'll tell you that my grandfather was in World War II. He was Polish, and he was there when the Germans showed up on September 1st, and we're not Jewish, we're Catholic, but he lied about his age so that he was not forced to enlist in the Nazi army and to fight for Hitler. And so he lied about his age, and he was short, and they believed him. There was no paperwork back then, like a driver's license, and they didn't have birth certificates or anything to prove it. So he was placed on a farm and spent the entire war farming for Hitler. But at the very end of the war, Hitler still forced him to be in one of these Todes marches where they marched. And years later, until he died just a few years ago, he would talk about how they were ready to starve to death. The man in front of him, in fact, picked up a potato and was ready to take a bite out of it as they were walking along a field because they hadn't eaten in days and they were ready to collapse. And he picked up a rotten potato off the ground that he found, and he went to go bite into it, and the SS shot him. And then my grandpa decided he wasn't hungry anymore. But it was horrifying, and so many people died in those marches. Luckily, though, the war was starting to come to a close, and by January 27th, 1945, the Soviet army entered Auschwitz, which was the largest camp, and they liberated the rest of the prisoners. Mostly 7,000 had only remained, and they were mostly ill and dying, but they still, obviously helped those people to survive. Many of them did survive, which is how we get the stories from these Holocaust supporters now. But you can see that's a whole bag of hair, which is really, really scary. And of course, Jewish culture was pretty much destroyed from here on out. The Nazis did a good job of trying to destroying, what happened to Jewish society and culture, and destroy all records and achievements that they had created. You can see that box of rings there, all those wedding rings from dead Jewish people. And this is just a great poem which says, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." And that was Pastor Martin Niemöller from Nazi Germany. And it was obviously a terrifying time, and we think that's how the Holocaust came to be, was that people were just afraid to speak out, afraid to do anything. And unfortunately, when you don't stand up for others, this is what can happen. And so as far as lasting effects, we see that 11 million people, we think, at least died. About 6 million Jews and 5 million other people. Some estimates are higher, some are lower. About 63% of the Jewish population in Europe were killed. 91% of the Jewish population in Poland was assassinated at these extermination camps. Of course, still to this day, we have a Holocaust Remembrance Day that was established in 1951, which was the Yom HaShoah. And finally, between 1945 and 1949, they heard the Nuremberg trials, where they basically analyzed the Nuremberg laws, and they brought to task all of these Nazi officials for their war crimes and said, how could you do this? How could you lead these camps and work at Dachau and Auschwitz, these extermination and concentration camps? And many of these people are obviously executed for these crimes. Many other people, left to go to the United States. I just saw in the news recently, it was like 100-year-old man was living in the United States all these years, and they were sending him back to Germany to stand trial for his crimes in World War II, and they were talking about imprisoning him or executing him. So it's something that still affects us to this day. Yet, despite the Holocaust, there are people who still fly the swastika, who fly the Nazi Party flag. There are still members of the Nazi Party in Germany to this day, and anti-Semitism, despite everything that happened, unfortunately still exists in the day. All right, guys, that wraps us up for now. Have a great day. Later.